The empath sits across from her therapist, describing something that shouldn't be possible. She feels everything in the room, the receptionist's anxiety, the couple arguing in the waiting area, the therapist's own hidden exhaustion. She reads all of it with surgical precision, but none of it touches her. Not one drop of it enters her system. The therapist writes emotional detachment in her notes and recommends further evaluation. But Carl Jung would have recognized this woman immediately because she wasn't detached. She was something psychology has never had a framework for. Jung encountered these people scattered throughout his clinical work, empaths who broke every rule in the book. They weren't overwhelmed by their sensitivity. They weren't bleeding out energy for everyone around them. They weren't martyring themselves on the altar of other people's pain. They had every perceptual gift a regular empath possesses: the ability to read rooms, detect lies, sense what's hiding beneath someone's performance. But they'd done something with those gifts that most empaths never do. They'd turn them inward. They'd learned to use empathy as armor instead of an open wound. Jung struggled to categorize them because they contradicted everything his field believed about sensitive people. The assumption was simple: if you feel deeply, you suffer deeply. If you perceive others' pain, you absorb it. If you're empathic, you're vulnerable. These people demolished that assumption. They felt more than anyone in the room and suffered less than everyone in it. And Jung became consumed with one question: how did they get there? What happened to them that transformed the same abilities destroying other empaths into something that functioned like psychological sovereignty? What he discovered was disturbing. These super empaths, every single one of them, had been through something that looked from the outside like complete psychological collapse. They hadn't learned techniques. They hadn't practiced better boundaries. They hadn't read the right books or attended the right retreats. They had been broken open by experiences so devastating that the person they used to be simply couldn't survive. And from that wreckage, something new emerged. Something with the same eyes but a completely different operating system. Today I'm going to walk you through what Jung actually documented about these individuals, the 3 specific psychological deaths they passed through, the abilities that surfaced on the other side, abilities regular empaths never develop because they never undergo the transformation required. And the reason everything mainstream psychology teaches about empathy as a gift of service is actually the lock that keeps your real power sealed away from you. It started with a single patient who made Jung question his own clinical instincts. She displayed every hallmark of deep empathic sensitivity: volatile childhood, hypervigilant nervous system trained from birth to read emotional weather systems, uncanny accuracy in perceiving what people were hiding, a history littered with narcissists, energy vampires, and people who'd used her sensitivity as their personal emotional life support. Standard empath profile. Except nothing about her matched what should have followed. She wasn't tired. She wasn't drained. She walked into rooms crackling with dysfunction and walked out without a scratch. She could describe someone's deepest wound within 3 minutes of meeting them, then turn around and forget about that person entirely. She had zero compulsion to fix, heal, or rescue anyone. Zero guilt about it. When Jung asked about her relationships, she described a small circle of people she'd chosen with what he called frightening precision. Everyone else existed outside a perimeter she maintained without effort, without anxiety, without apology. Jung's first instinct was defensive shutdown. He assumed trauma had severed her empathic wiring. that she'd walled herself off to survive, but the data refused to cooperate with that interpretation. Her perceptual accuracy was sharper than any empath he'd studied. She wasn't feeling less, she was feeling more clearly. The noise was gone. The signal was pristine. She hadn't shut down her empathy. She'd undergone a transformation so fundamental that her empathy now operated by different rules entirely. And when Jung mapped how she'd gotten there, he found a pattern that repeated across every super empath he subsequently identified. 3 distinct psychological deaths. Not metaphorical deaths dressed up in poetic language. Actual ego annihilations, where a core piece of identity was destroyed and never rebuilt. The first death was the death of the savior. Every empath Jung worked with had organized their identity around being the one who helps, the healer, the listener, the person who holds space, who understands when no one else does, who stays when everyone else leaves. This wasn't just something they did, it was who they were. Strip away the helping and they couldn't find themselves underneath it. The savior identity was their skeleton. Super empaths had lost this skeleton completely, and the loss was never voluntary. Here's what it looked like in practice. The empath poured years, sometimes their entire adult life, into someone. A parent who was never satisfied. A partner who took everything and returned nothing. A friend whose crises were endless and whose gratitude was non-existent. The empath stayed because somewhere in their bones they believed their love was medicine. That if they just understood deeply enough, held on long enough, gave generously enough, the person would transform. Then came the day when clarity arrived like a blade. The empath looked at this person they'd sacrificed years for and saw, truly saw, that this person was never going to change. Not because they couldn't, because they didn't want to. The person was comfortable exactly where they were. Every crisis, every need, every emotional emergency the empath had been responding to for years was not a cry for help. It was a system working as designed. And the empath was the fuel it ran on. This realization didn't inspire renewed determination. It killed something. The part of the empath that believed love heals people. The part that found purpose in being needed. The part that could look at someone's wound and feel compelled to touch it. That part died. And what followed was a void so complete that most empaths who glimpse it run screaming back to their old patterns. They find a new person to save, a new cause to pour into, anything to avoid standing in the emptiness where their purpose used to be. Jung watched this retreat happen hundreds of times. The empath would get close to the death, feel the ground dissolving, and scramble backward into the familiar identity, because the familiar suffering was less terrifying than the unknown emptiness. But the ones who became super empaths didn't retreat. Some couldn't. The devastation was too total for resurrection. Others made the brutal choice to stay in the void and see what it contained. And what emerged was something Jung called empathic neutrality. They could still see wounds with perfect clarity, but seeing a wound no longer activated the compulsion to heal it. Perception was liberated from obligation. They could witness someone suffering and feel compassion without feeling responsibility. They could understand someone's pattern without being conscripted into fixing it. To regular empaths, this looked like cruelty. To Jung, it looked like the first authentic freedom an empath had ever experienced. The second death cut deeper because it targeted something empaths didn't even realize they were addicted to. Jung called it the the death of the mirror. Empaths don't just help people heal, they help people feel real. Every empath Jung studied had spent their life being the surface other people used to see themselves, the listener who made you feel heard, the witness who made your experience valid, the presence that reflected you back to yourself more clearly than you could see alone. Empaths were living mirrors, and they derived enormous identity from this function, being the one who truly sees people. That felt sacred, irreplaceable, like a calling. The death of the mirror happened when the empath finally needed to be seen themselves. After years of reflecting everyone else, they hit a moment of genuine need, grief, crisis, exhaustion, collapse, and turned to the people they'd been mirroring for years. And those people stared back blankly, not with cruelty, with incapacity. They literally could not see the empath as a person with needs because they'd never related to the empath as a person. They'd related to the empath as a function, a utility, psychological equipment. The empath realized in that moment that every relationship they'd built around being a mirror was not actually a relationship. It was a service arrangement they'd never consciously agreed to. The people they'd poured their reflective gifts into didn't love them. They loved what the empath did for them. Remove the function and the connection evaporated. This killed the mirror identity. And the emptiness that followed was different from the first death, more personal, more humiliating. Because the empath had to face the possibility that they'd never been loved for who they were, only for what they provided. Super empaths sat in this humiliation until it burned through, and what emerged was what Jung called empathic selectivity, the ability to choose who receives the gift of being seen by you. Regular empaths reflected everyone automatically. Super empaths turned their mirror into something you had to earn access to. They could perceive someone completely, understand them down to the marrow, and simply choose not to share a single insight, not out of spite, out of sovereignty. Their perception belonged to them now. It was no longer public property. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. The third death was the one Jung found most difficult to witness because it dismantled something empaths consider holy. He called it the death of the cord, the severing of compulsive connection. Every empath Jung encountered carried an unconscious belief that felt more like oxygen than ideology. I am meant to stay connected to everyone I can feel. Openness was spiritual duty. Maintaining bonds was sacred obligation. The idea of deliberately cutting someone off, especially someone whose pain you could still feel, registered as violence against your own nature. Super empaths had committed this violence, deliberately, repeatedly, and they'd survived it. This death usually began with a slow, sickening recognition. The empath would look at their family, their social circle, their community, people they had maintained connection with for years, sometimes decades, and finally admit what their perception had been, screaming all along. These connections were parasitic. The empath was maintaining bonds with people who fed on their openness while offering nothing in return. And the empath's belief in sacred connection was the mechanism keeping them available for consumption. What followed looked, to the outside world, like a breakdown. The empath would cut off their family, end friendships that spanned years, withdraw from communities they'd been embedded in for their entire life, Sometimes they'd disappear entirely. New city, new number, new life. People around them diagnosed this as depression, avoidance, mental illness. What no one recognized was that the empath was performing emergency surgery on their own psyche, removing the cords that were killing them. Jung observed these empaths existing in profound isolation for months, sometimes years, alone in ways that would destroy most people. But super empaths didn't just survive the aloneness. They discovered something inside it that changed everything. They found out who they were without anyone else's energy flowing through them. For the first time in their lives, they felt only their own feelings, thought only their own thoughts, existed in the clean silence of their own consciousness. And from this silence emerged what Jung considered the super empath's most formidable ability. He called it sovereign empathy, the capacity to perceive everything while absorbing nothing. Super empaths could walk into a room saturated with chaos and maintain perfect internal stillness. Could sit across from someone in the grip of rage and feel the rage precisely without it entering their system. Could detect manipulation in real time and observe it with the dispassionate interest of a scientist studying a specimen. This wasn't dissociation. Jung was relentless about this distinction. Dissociation numbs perception. Sovereign empathy heightens it. These people were taking in more data than ever. But the automatic pipeline between perceiving someone's emotional state and being infected by it had been severed permanently. They saw everything. They caught nothing. Once Jung mapped the 3 deaths, he began documenting specific abilities that appeared only in empaths who'd passed through all 3. Not 1 or 2, all 3. The transformation was sequential and cumulative. Skip a death, and the later abilities never developed. The first ability he cataloged was what he called instant architecture reading. Regular empaths could eventually figure out someone's psychological patterns through extended contact. Super empaths perceived the entire psychological structure within minutes. They'd meet someone and immediately see the load-bearing walls, the core wound, the primary defense system, the compensation patterns, the unconscious drives, not as intuition, as clear structural perception, the way an engineer looks at a building and sees the skeleton beneath the facade. But the critical difference wasn't the speed of perception, it was what they did with it. Regular empaths perceived danger and overrode the perception, gave benefit of the doubt, hoped they were wrong, waited for proof. Super empaths perceived danger and moved immediately. Without apology, without explanation, without the exhausting internal negotiation that kept regular empaths trapped in situations their own perception had already flagged as harmful. Pattern identified, decision executed. No gap between seeing and acting. To people without this ability, super empaths appeared ruthlessly judgmental, but Jung understood they weren't judging. They were reading structural data with the same confidence a doctor reads an X-ray. You don't give a fracture the benefit of the doubt. You respond to what the image shows you. The second ability was psychological invisibility. After the death of the mirror identity, super empaths stopped broadcasting. Regular empaths leaked emotional signals constantly. Their openness was visible, readable, targetable. Narcissists could spot them across a room. Energy vampires could feel them through a wall, but super empaths had gone dark. Their internal state was unreadable. Other empaths couldn't sense them. Manipulators couldn't find a handhold. They moved through social environments like something that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. This wasn't masking, that exhausting performance of a false self. Super empaths weren't projecting anything false. They simply weren't projecting at all. Once you no longer need to be seen, validated, or understood by others, you stop emitting the signals that make you visible to predators. Jung found this ability emerged organically. You couldn't practice it or learn it through technique. It was the natural consequence of no longer needing anything from anyone. Need makes you visible. Self-sufficiency makes you a ghost. The third ability disturbed Jung because of what it implied about the nature of pattern recognition. He called it trajectory perception. Super empaths didn't just see where someone was psychologically. They saw where that person was going. They'd observe a couple and know the relationship's expiration date. They'd watch a colleague and predict the career implosion months before the first visible crack. They'd meet someone new and perceive, with quiet certainty, exactly how the story would end. This wasn't prophecy. It was extrapolation operating at a level of sophistication that normal consciousness couldn't access. Super empaths perceived the directional vectors embedded in current patterns the way a physicist reads the trajectory of a moving object. Given this speed, this angle, this mass, it lands here. Given this wound, this defense, this blind spot, it ends like this. And they were right with a consistency that unsettled everyone around them, including Jung. But the defining feature of this ability wasn't the prediction, it was the restraint. Regular empaths who glimpsed where something was heading would exhaust themselves trying to prevent it. Warnings, interventions, emotional labor spent trying to redirect someone away from the cliff they were walking toward. Super empaths warned once, if the person had earned that courtesy, and then stepped back, watched, let consequences arrive on schedule. The death of the savior had permanently eliminated the compulsion to save people from the outcomes their own patterns were generating. The fourth ability was what Jung found most unsettling to observe because it violated every assumption about what empathy should look like. He called it empathic ruthlessness. Super empaths could witness genuine suffering, deep, real, devastating suffering, and choose to do absolutely nothing about it. Not because they couldn't feel it. They felt it with crystalline precision, but feeling someone's pain no longer activated an automatic rescue response. They could distinguish instantly between suffering that deserved their engagement and suffering designed to manipulate them, between someone genuinely drowning and someone performing drowning to get the empath back in the water, between pain that was part of someone's necessary growth and pain the empath could actually alleviate. And when the calculation came back wrong, when helping would cost more than it healed, when the suffering was self-generated and the person preferred it to change, super empaths turned away without guilt. Jung watched super empaths ignore crying family members, decline desperate phone calls, walk past people clearly in distress. And each time, he tested whether this was cruelty or discernment. Each time, it was discernment. The crying family member was performing. The phone call was a manipulation. The person in distress had created their situation through choices they refused to examine. Super empaths weren't cold. They were accurate. And accuracy, when it means withholding help from people who don't actually want help, looks monstrous to anyone who can't see what the super empath sees. This constellation of abilities, instant architecture reading, psychological invisibility, trajectory perception, empathic ruthlessness, created a type of person that existing psychological frameworks couldn't contain. They looked like empaths from the outside, felt like something entirely different from the inside. They possessed all the sensitivity, all the perception, all the depth, channeled through a self that no longer existed to serve everyone else. Jung's ultimate conclusion was simple and radical. Regular empaths are controlled by their empathy. It runs them, determines their relationships, their energy levels, their suffering, their choices. They are passengers in a vehicle their sensitivity is driving. Super empaths drive. Same vehicle, same perceptual equipment. Opposite relationship to it. And the steering wheel doesn't get handed over through therapy, self-care routines, or boundary-setting workshops. It gets seized through psychological death so complete that the old driver is annihilated. Most empaths will never make this journey. Jung was honest about this without being cruel. The 3 deaths aren't something you can schedule or engineer. They happen when life delivers devastation so thorough that the savior, the mirror, and the cord cannot survive it. You can't force the deaths, but you can stop preventing them. Every time life tries to kill the savior in you, and you find a new person to rescue instead of letting it die, you've delayed the transformation. Every time the mirror identity starts cracking, and you scramble to find someone new who needs your reflection, you've reset the clock. Every time you feel the cord stretching to its breaking point and you pull back instead of letting it snap, you've chosen the familiar cage over the unknown freedom. Jung believed the path from regular empath to super empath wasn't about adding anything. Not more tools, not more knowledge, not more spiritual practice. It was about subtraction, about letting the identities that organized your empathic life be destroyed without replacing them, about enduring the void between who you were and who you're becoming without filling it with another rescue mission, another person who needs your mirror, another cord you refuse to cut. The emptiness is the transformation. The void is the chrysalis. And what emerges from it, sovereign, selective, invisible, ruthless in its discernment, is what empathy was always supposed to become before the world taught you it existed for everyone else's benefit. That's the secret the psychological industry can't afford to tell you. Not that empaths need better coping strategies, but that the coping strategies are what's preventing the metamorphosis. That boundaries aren't the destination. They're the kindergarten version of what becomes effortless after the deaths. That self-care isn't the answer. It's the consolation prize for people who refuse to let the self that needs constant care finally die. Super empaths don't practice boundaries. They don't need to. The deaths eliminated the part of them that let people in indiscriminately. Super empaths don't schedule self-care. There's nothing to recover from when you've stopped hemorrhaging energy into everyone around you. Super empaths don't manage their sensitivity. Their sensitivity manages itself now, perceiving everything, absorbing nothing, serving the empath instead of consuming them. Same gift, opposite experience, and the bridge between them isn't healing, it's dying. 3 deaths that most empaths will spend their entire lives running from, and a handful who can't run anymore, because the devastation caught them, held them down, and burned away everything that wasn't real, who emerge on the other side as something psychology doesn't have a name for yet. Something that feels like empathy, but functions like power. Something that looks like sensitivity, but operates like sovereignty. Something the world desperately needs, but can never be mass-produced. because you can't package death into a weekend workshop or sell transformation in a 12-week program. You either die these deaths or you don't, and if you do, you'll never explain what you've become to anyone who hasn't. You'll just move through the world seeing everything, carrying nothing, choosing precisely who deserves access to the rarest thing you possess. A consciousness that perceives the full depth of human experience without being destroyed by it. That's what Jung found. That's what the super empath actually is. And that's why everything you've been taught about empathy being a gift you give to others is the exact belief that has to die before your real gift can finally wake up. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.